It's a bit of a bifurcated presentation today. I want to focus one on, some of my sense of where developer community is going and where there's been a sort of increasing activity in the fragmented margins. And in the back half, kind of sharing some practical tips around how um, we've sort of engaged with these challenges more recently. So a little bit about me. I used to be head of marketing and community at Leap Motion. So I ran all of their developer programs, partnerships, web, brand, social media, go-to-market strategy, academic programs, half a dozen other things. So, Leap Motion is a hand tracking startup. They were based in San Francisco. The team is still based in San Francisco. They went through an M&A with their largest customer a couple of years ago. So, during my 6 years there, I built a community of 800,000 users, 230,000 developers, worked really closely with product, with engineering, with sort of everybody throughout the organization. One of my proudest achievements while I was there was I produced the first VR design guide for the third wave of VR. So a lot of my focus here is going to be in the sort of emerging technology space. I know we had talk from like the DevRel lead at Stripe last time, and that is obviously like operating at a much larger scale. I've been sort of wading around in a much smaller pool for quite some time. I like working on bleeding edge stuff. So more recently, I've been sort of splitting my focus to some extent. I spend about half of my week being CEO of Firefly. Actually, even before I get to that, and this sort of dovetails with why Flyless was so interesting to me. I very rarely traveled, even during the peak years at Leap Motion. I had a bit of a reputation at the office for being the office AI. Which is to say never present, but somehow always ubiquitous. So I'm a huge fan of the concept of killing commutes and killing just everything that is distracting and wrong with having to, burn hundreds or thousands of hours every year in transit. And that is sort of how I've structured my life. So on to where my focus has been. I split my time between my independent consultancy, where I work with early stage tech startups and scale ups. So it's VR, AR, remote collaboration, blockchain, mobile apps. And the other half of my time, I'm VP marketing at Metaverse, which is this startup that's been around for a few years, but only recently launched a major product just last month, in fact. So they're aiming to build this universal web-based 3D XR creation tool and editor. So, one thing I wanted to share about what I've seen taking place over the last 5 years, especially, in the mid-2010s, when we were really kicking off the VR revolution, we found that most of the meaningful online group conversations that were taking place were typically on public platforms, especially Reddit. Leap Motion cut a lot of its teeth in the early VR developer community on Reddit. That is where almost all of the meaningful, important conversations were happening. Twitter was, to a large extent, a sort of a second-class citizen. There were a few forums, but for the most part, if you wanted to actually talk to the people who were building things and having conversations about where the technology was going, Reddit was where you went. What we've seen over the last few years increasingly is, VR has become increasingly popular. Public platforms have become flooded with consumers. Developers have been retreating to private platforms. This has coincided with the rise of Slack and Discord as being extremely popular community building platforms. So, this is kind of to be expected. Like, emerging technologies tend to generate a lot of noise, and finding the signal often means throwing up barriers against noisy people. So now if you want to really connect with the 2,500 people who are actually doing the most interesting work in the VR space, what you do is you go and you find private Slack channels. obviously, this represents some challenges for DevRel. It means that, you see this fragmentation into smaller user groups. Developer relations is taking place in more channels. It's difficult to track and escalate some of these conversations in Slack and Discord. Um, and it's also the usual flip side of that, which is that, you have this power user problem. It's very easy for DevRel to want to focus in on these smaller communities of 2,000 to 5,000 people. They're great for rapid and nuanced product feedback. These are usually the places, the crucibles where some really fantastic content is going to come out. If you want to promote a hackathon, if you want to do a lot of things and do it synchronously or very, very fast, these are the places to do it increasingly. And it requires time. It almost never requires spend. But of course, these groups also tend to have radically different needs compared to the sort of more silent majority of developers. You end up, in the case of Leap Motion, for example, the danger was always that we would cater to the highly focused power users who wanted to be able to, edit the root code for the drivers that made the integration with Unity work, as opposed to everybody else who was just pulling out their hair because they wanted example code. So this kind of dovetails with the need for multi-channel engagement and surveying, a number of other things. So this kind of takes me into the next piece, which is where I've been focused a lot more recently over the past year, which is that this retreat to the private and this increasing trend towards escaping noise has also coincided with a sort of long form content renaissance. And I see this as being the flip side of it, which is that if it's too noisy and finding the signal among the noise is becoming more and more difficult, high quality signal increasingly comes at a high premium. And we're seeing this in podcasting and in long form emails especially. The podcast world is showing no sign of slowing. We've got over 800,000 active podcasts in the world right now compared to just 550,000 a couple of years ago. COVID has accelerated this trend, especially. We're seeing, like, globally, podcast listens are up more than 40%. Europeans, more than 50%. Interestingly enough, in the US, we're seeing podcast listens decline. I think we can attribute this mostly to the fact that within the United States, which is a very large country with very long commutes, podcast consumption is often associated with travel, with commutes, or with being on airplanes. So we've seen a decline in that. I think what we're probably going to see post-COVID is that people who have gotten into podcasts or podcasting will likely stick with it, whereas we'll see a rebound within the US market. And then the other half of that is just the proliferation of long form emails. These are essay length, oftentimes. Think in terms of the scope of a Medium article. The most successful ones tend to be focused on highly specific industry topics, like healthcare and blockchain, for example. That's a specific intersection that is in the process of exploding right now. Augmented reality, virtual reality in business. These tend to be direct, they tend to be highly personal, and they tend to be weekend reads. Think of something that people fire up on Sunday mornings. Robert Miller, actually, who's been doing some really fantastic work on the blockchain and healthcare side, I really have to point to, because this is essentially a very strong model for like a DevRel professional who wants to really put themselves forward as a strong voice for their company or for their brand, as well as really create this very strong personal connection, especially if you want to be synonymous with whatever vertical you happen to be working in. So that takes me over to the work that we've been doing at Metaverse. As I said, it's this web-based engine. We want to make creating 3D and XR experiences simple and easy, make it work regardless of platform, browser, or device. We are primarily targeting marketers, designers, and educators. Developers are also an audience in there. Like, specifically JavaScript developers or developers who may be frustrated with the amount of time it takes to build out and deploy an XR application in Unity, or are looking for something that is web-based. The thing with Metaverse was that the core engine that makes all this stuff work was built over the course of 4 years, but there was no real product until last month. Until last month, there really wasn't anything worth sharing except for like a car demo. So while we were in the process of getting this thing ready to go, we wanted to explore how we might be able to make ourselves synonymous with this intersection, and we turned to podcasting. So the XR for Business podcast is something that I run with the CEO of Metaverse. I'm sort of back-end production. He's the host. And again, it is one of these intersectional things where there's XR and there's business, and we sort of operate right in the middle, where there is a great deal of interest, but not necessarily a lot of focus. There are lots of VR podcasts. There's Voices of VR. There's the Research in VR podcast. There's quite a few of them. But ours is the only one that is specifically business and enterprise focused. At this point, we've managed to hit like over 110,000 listens, which is pretty good for a niche industry podcast. And we've also been releasing transcripts with each episode. We do our editorial planning in Airtable. We do localized recording using Zencaster. This is a really handy service if you are looking to ever do something along these lines, because the issue with doing recordings on Zoom is that Zoom is cloud-based. They do a lot of compression on the audio that they're getting. So if you're doing a recording, the audio that you'll get, sometimes your voice will slow down and then it will speed up because of networking or other issues. Zencaster is rather neat because it runs in a browser tab and it's capturing the audio locally and then sending it out asynchronously, even as you're having a synchronous conversation. And if you mute the tab, you can actually use it in combination with Zoom, which is really cool if you're looking to have like a webinar or web conference with good quality audio, but with real-time Zoom video. So something that we're actually kind of poking at right now is host webinars where we're able to do like good quality audio capture, because right now it's a real bitch trying to get it. And we use Castos and WordPress. Castos is a fairly neat hosting platform for the podcast. They have a WordPress integration. I'm a coding dabbler, but I'm not a web developer by any stretch of the imagination. And this was something that I wanted to be able to build out relatively rapidly. So this is what I had done. Let's see. Ooh, we got, might be a good place to. Oh, okay. I was going to say, if there's any questions, I know there's a Q&A thing in Zoom as well. So if anybody has a question, feel free to raise your hand or, just interrupt me. It's all good. So let's get back here. The interesting thing about this is that over the course of the year, while we were running this podcast and continue to run the podcast, we were able to get some really top tier guests. Our first guest was the president of HTC China, which, Alvin is a really big name in the XR space. And since then we've interviewed, a lot of people from, different global organizations. It tends to be a nice mix of developers who are doing novel or interesting work and like top tier leaders within big companies that are driving XR adoption. So we've been able to tease out a lot of stuff from, proof points. So, being able to build out the numbers case that VR and AR have these specific value adds within large organizations, which is because a lot of these big companies tend to be really cagey and they don't want to share their bottom line numbers, it becomes very difficult to be able to build that case out. But especially over the last year, and this isn't just us, but this is more broadly, a lot of those numbers and a lot of those business cases have been coming out. And to the extent that we've been able to contribute to that, it's been really good. The other aspect of it as well is that and this is sort of where the mercenary side of things comes in. If you want to get into a really good conversation with a top tier leader at a potential client or a potential partner, reaching out to say, hey, would you like to be on our podcast, is often going to be a lot more appealing than, hi, I'm somebody that you don't know. Do you want to have a cold call about our magic product? So in this case, it's been able to open up a lot of doors for us and able to be in terms of having these conversations. And oftentimes the conversation that takes place before and after the interview is just as fruitful, if not more so, than the interview itself. Because before and after the interview is usually where the gossip happens, and where we're able to share some of the things that we're working on without the podcast itself being just constantly hitting listeners over the head with this is what we're doing. So a lot of these companies have since we've since begun working with them directly, or have sort of long-term partnerships that are being built out. And then obviously that brings us to sort of more today. We launched the Metaverse platform back in June, and now we're actually seeing some people doing some really interesting things with it. One of them is Sakar Kaida, who's over at Oracle. He is the co-founder of their XR lab. So we were able to do a developer spotlight on him on the Metaverse website, and we're sharing that around as a case study for how the platform can be used for e-com. But at the same time, we also interviewed him on the podcast. So we were able to reach the listener network and be able to feature Sakar's work and spotlight him as a developer without being obnoxiously salesy, which is always like the big challenge. So what's next right now? We're applying a lot of the lessons that I learned from working at Leap Motion, and from working with a few other companies. The product is now in the wild. It's time for us to building out demos, building out docs, building out virtual event presences, all the usual suspects. We are building out our programs right now, a mix of DevRel and marketing to non-coding creatives. The brand and the go-to-market strategy are driving the content strategy. And the content strategy is that we want to be synonymous with the intersection of XR and business. So that involves building out the editorial pipeline. It involves leveraging this massive base of interviews and long-form content that we've built out over the past year, pulling out a lot of those data points. I'll also say that the transcripts have been an incredible resource, not just in terms of SEO, not just in terms of accessibility, but also like we're looking at taking them together and putting out a book, or leveraging some of these older case studies as we move forward, because we are essentially now subject domain experts in all of these areas. When we want to go talk to an enterprise within any given industry, and we have the data points and the connections to be able to back that up. So that's about the extent of it.